much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I do realize you've had a long day full of workshops and talks, so I'm going to try to make this as exciting as possible. Shoot your hands up if you have questions. I'm happy to just engage as we go along. I'm really particularly interested being here today talking about analytics, talking about data, talking about insight. So to start off with, I'm not going to talk about analytics. I'm not going to talk about the newspaper and how we measure our readers or how we're trying to engage with our readers. We do that, and we're trying to do that very well. Obviously with a paywall, we're looking at very different ways of engaging, talking to our readers, and being part of a membership. But that's not what I'm talking about today, because that's not my job, and that's not what I'm hired to do. I'm, like I said, the data editor, the data journalism editor, the Times and the Sunday Times. So I work across both titles, which, as you know, are completely separate newspapers, as you might have noticed, taking two separate positions on Brexit, which is keeping things very exciting for us at the office. But essentially, my team was brought in about 3 years ago to try to help kind of change and shape and rethink how we're doing journalism, to kind of bring in this data stuff and see something that we can do with it. And so today I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what we've been doing, where we think things are going, the exciting stuff that we've been trying to do, what we're trying to push the boundaries on. I'll talk a little bit about our analysis that we did in the election, what we're doing to do this week, which is why I've just snuck in 10 minutes before my talk. We've been just completely swamped in Brexit data, as you can imagine, and that's what I'll be kind of talking about today. But as my title sort of indicates, I'm particularly going to focus on when we're using data for data's sake and when we're using data for the sake of insight. And that's the main focus of what we're trying to do at the Times and the Sunday Times with my team there. So first of all, to start off with, I just like to point out that data journalism is nothing new. So what I do isn't new at all. I fully intend for my job to be redundant very soon. I hope it is. And the way that I see it is that data journalism is just journalism, and one day that will simply be what it is. So to start off with, data journalism, you might have heard this term, you might see it around a bit, and every newspaper is doing it differently. So The Guardian was really well known for starting the Guardian data blog. It was a fantastic blog in which people could sort of see really cool visualizations and find really interesting, engaging storytelling devices. You might know a lot from the FT, who tend to do also very exciting visualizations that really break down market data, but they've also been pushing the agenda in other ways as well. You might have heard of AMPed, which was a Trinity Mirror kind of offset that tried to essentially take data and bring it into sort of bite-sized, digestible, interesting kind of GIF-related, BuzzFeed-esque ways of accessing information, which was really great for getting people to sort of engage a bit more with data. Unfortunately, they are no longer around, but I still consider them kind of an influencer in this area. So the Times and Sunday Times, we realized that data journalism is out there, that people are doing it in different ways, but we tried to figure out what is it the best way for us. So we could have started back. If you look up at this example that I have up here, the lovely old black and white visualization is from 1895 in the Times. It was how we visualized and told the general election results. And the one you see on the other side is actually the Daily Telegraph in 2015. And as you'll see, there's not much new here in terms of visualization, really in terms of the makeup of our country, and really what's kind of going on in how we push data journalism for that sake. So the Times sort of said, okay, look, data journalism isn't new. We've been trying to make sense of data for a really long time. We're known for sort of helping people digest things, and we've been known for, and every paper's been known for trying to simplify the complex. That's what journalism is, isn't it? Taking information, bringing it to readers to understand. That's not new. Visualization isn't new. So what can we do to make it new? So the Times sort of said, okay, there's this data stuff out there. We realize there's this influx of digitization, and there's so much information going out there, as Panama Papers can attest to, Swiss leaks, WikiLeaks, HSBC files. You're noticing a trend in which journalists are trying to figure out how are we going to swim with all this information going on. And that was kind of the remit in which we operated. So the Times said, let's do something new then. So instead of adding to the void, instead of just adding a chart to a story, instead of just kind of adding an extra piece of information or a map or a graph, why don't we make data the story itself? So we built and we set up a computational investigative team. It's not as daunting as it sounds. I think most of the time, even saying that in a newsroom, people sort of cringe at the idea of that. But essentially, we just put technology directly into our newsroom. And that was the plan from the offset, was to try to take this really complex nature and sort of say, how do we reinvent journalism? And I think this is what's really important and why I've been sort of asked here today, at least I think this might be why I'm asked here today, is that what I'm doing in journalism is is trying to be reflected in all remits of society. How do we push the agenda of our industries by using technology to our advantage? Instead of chasing technology, how can we use it to advance what we're doing? And so that's what we're doing at the Times, is trying to advance journalism with technology and data. So it's a computational investigative team. I have a statistician on staff. I have programmers and journalists all working together. This is our tiny itty-bitty core team, but it expands and contracts as and when we work on new stories and more complex stories and various things like that. So this is the kind of remit that we're working in. And the whole premise of our team is to say we want to use data in a way that and use computing in a way that a human could never do without a computer. So sure, maybe a journalist could technically kind of go through a ton of information, and as Watergate was one of the classic investigative examples, you can dig through a ton of stories, you can dig through a ton of documents, but we are specifically brought in a way that a human could never possibly handle either. We're talking big data, modeling, matching, in a way that either a human could never do it, or it would take a very, very long time. So the best way that I like to explain it is, to our journalists, is sort of saying, if you had a project, and this, like I said, goes to journalism or any industry, if you have a project that you're finding you're doing something over and over and over again, why are you doing it over and over again when a script or a computer can do that for you? So if you had an infinite number of interns that were brought to your organization, and you think, if I only had 50 interns sitting and working on this, we could build a great database, or we could analyze something that you really wanted to see. So that's what our team is brought in to do, is we write those interns. We write these scripts that can process information. So to give you some examples, these are 3 front-page stories that we worked on quite recently. First one, the tax avoidance investigation in the center, not quite recently, but that was one of our big stories that we worked on a couple years ago. So someone came to the Times in a classic way that you do in journalism, with a sheet of paper. Here's a list of people on the Liberty tax scheme, a tax avoidance scheme. And journalists are very excited. They can, scroll through it, and they could see big names like Jimmy Carr and the rest of them on it. But they came to us and said, "What can you do with this?" It had coffee stains on it, it had markings all over it. It was all crumbled up. What can you do with this? So our team took it and we digitized the list. It's amazing what personal information people use for things like tax avoidance lists. So they had personal emails, phone numbers, all kinds of information on it. And we just ran it against every database that you could think of. So once we digitized this sheet of paper full of information, we then ran it against, like I said, just tons and tons of different organizations so we ran it through a list of politicians, MPs, NHS trust members, the legal profession, the nonprofit sector, public sector, whatever it was, and we just found names and names and names and names. And this, in this case, was a journalist could never have found that without it. We have another piece on there about GP's award $2.4 billion in deals. So this was us taking the open database of GP's registered interests, and we took the NHS awards, essentially, that are given, grants and awards and various contracts that are given to various bodies, and we matched those two together and found a series of conflict of interest, and doing that allowed us to investigate. The last one on the side is where we had a lot of questions, and there was a lot of interest around the charity sector, and we definitely didn't want to go after the charity sector, but we definitely wanted to see where there were instances that could be looked at further. So we looked through documents and documents of financial statements from charities, and where they have CEOs or executives that are making $100,000, sometimes $200,000, 12% of their income's going to people at the top and not out to the people that they're collecting money for. So these were really interesting pieces, and each of them are examples in which we've used technology, and we sort of used data manipulation to kind of lead us into the story, and then the journalism had to do work for the rest of it. So this goes to journalism or any industry, as obviously technology helps lift it, push the boundaries, dig deeper and dig faster in a way that you never could before. But then obviously the human element has to come on top of that. We would never have just printed a story from an output that came from one of our scripts. It's the beginning of an investigation, as it is with a lot across the industry. You might know about the FIFA files. This is another big piece of ours, 3 front pages up here. So this came very similarly, where my editor sort of said, oh, we've got these documents, but I don't think the data team should be involved because, they're emails, they're not data. And to which, of course, I had to laugh and say, data is anything you can digitize. And I'm like, really? And like, our team can analyze sound if you wanted us to. And having to explain and starting to walk journalists through, or anyone, like I said, explain to them what it is to analyze data. So he said, okay, well, here's these emails. What can you do with them? And this is what we did. So what you see in the sort of inbox is actually the visualization element that we did. So once we published the story, we put it in an inbox format so people could look at it as if you were looking through their inbox and sort of investigate bin Hammam's workings. But the most interesting thing we did was this modular network that you see. So simply by just taking emails, we stripped out the to, the from, the subject line, and the timestamp of the email. That was it. We didn't even start looking at the text or what was even being said inside the emails. We just took that metadata of the emails, and we built this network. And as you can see, in the center of that network, it has a lot of communications going on. So this was bin Hammam's personal assistant, and that's where it all began. And this allowed us to start that investigative process. So from here, we sort of said, what are these conversations and these clusters happening here, over here, over here, over here? We would sort of zoom in, collect those documents and say, why are all these people talking together? And you'd find really interesting things like, thank you very much for our lunch today. Here's a bank transaction to thank you for it. And we were watching sort of how the bribes were working and actually had connections and data linking all of that together. So it's been hugely influential for us to push accountability and investigative journalism in this sense. And this is when data actually gives the evidence and the proof that in ways that we might not have. I think most people know that, or could have guessed that maybe FIFA was a bit corrupt, but this data actually allowed us to bring that evidence forward. Very similar to the Sunday Times, we also worked on the doping scandal. So this was a particularly fun project, all of them are, but I never thought in my life I'd be analyzing blood data. This is what we were given, though. It was a lot of information. 11 years of data, 12,000 blood tests, and over 5,000 athletes. It was the largest drug test leak in history. So essentially it was a massive trove of the blood results that when athletes in the World Championships, Olympics, and other contests go to test, they've got to get their blood drawn. So it was just files and files and individual files of blood results, measuring their hemoglobin levels, measuring all sorts of things. And with this sort of, it was someone from within the IAAF that said, I'm tired of nothing being done about this. I need to come forward. This came forward obviously after our paper being well known for breaking the Lance Armstrong story. They came to us for further investigation. So this came up to our plate, and like I said, we analyzed all of this blood data. We worked with experts in the doping areas and people who've invented the EPO drug tests, and tons of them to sort of say, how do we find these fluctuations? How do we find when these abnormal levels? And we just did a ton of analysis on that. And what the amazing thing that came out of that, not only was that there was insane findings, that 80% of Russian medals in the endurance events were suspicious of doping. Not only to say that was 140 medals under suspicion overall, but amazingly, after all these revelations coming out, we have all these athletes coming forward saying, I want to show I'm clean. So we have these a fantastic list of them coming through. And this allowed us to push the envelope even further. So when we first broke the story, we were heavily scrutinized for, obviously, for what we were publishing. But we were scrutinized also by saying, that we didn't know what we were talking about. Despite, as I mentioned to you, we went to the leading drug experts in the industry. We were working with people across the world, from Australia to Germany, to the United States and the UK, to make sure that we got this right. But this allowed us to go even further. So because athletes like Mo Farah and the rest of them agreed to let us publish them, we were able to show the kind of robustness of our data. So in this case, you can see Mo Farah's blood results over time. This is called a biological passport. So we're analyzing, like I said, his various results over time. The gray bits in the top and the bottom are abnormalities for someone his size and at the altitude in which he was competing. And someone like Gumri at the bottom is someone who was already banned for drug doping, so we were able to use his blood results, and you can sort of see these fluctuations. And this is what a lot of the people in the industry were telling us, is when you have a transfusion to try to hide your blood, you see these markings up and down. But anyways, this allowed for us to kind of really push the envelope a bit further. The last example I'm just going to bring to you is obviously what we did in the election. So last year, 2015, in the lead up to the general election in the UK, our team was brought in to do a robust analysis of the election. So now we're kind of moving from doing investigative storytelling to sort of say, how can we bring statistical rigor to the newsroom? And believe it or not, journalists and newspapers are really trying to push over each other and edge up on how to get a cleaner, fresher story when there's this much information out. And so this has been really valuable. We did a fantastic piece showing where voters voted last time, where they were voting now. We broke that down by really helping dissect this rising UKIP and the sort of flocking of the Lib Dems, as you can see here. These Sankey graphs are classically used in engineering, but we were able to kind of bring that academic visualization into journalism. And we've seen these visualizations being circulated across the board, which has been really fun. But this is essentially kind of where we were looking at all the polls, and we were looking at where everything was going. But after this analysis, we had to stop. We were looking at the data, and we just thought, this is not right. The margins were really wide. The sample sizes were really small. They were sort of skewing some of the results for constituencies that they didn't quite have enough data for and just pulling it directly down from the national level. My statisticians say, we can't use this data. I don't trust it. I don't want to do any modeling on the back of it. So we made the really easy decision, but the very difficult one to enforce, that said, we're not using polling data in the lead up to the election. Of course, my editor was like, why are you so special? Every other newspaper is doing it. Every other data team is doing it. But I'm very fortunate that they stood our ground with us, obviously, because in the end, we were quite right. So we didn't do any sort of projections after this. So I think this was in November of 2014. We did a lot of analysis about what the constituencies looked like and information, but in the end, we ran these on-the-day analysis on the election. So we built a massive database of demographic information. So we took information about every single constituency, and we just pulled in every database that we can find on it. So unemployment figures, council housing, student levels, sizes of businesses, ethnicity, you name it. And we pulled this all in, and we did a classification tree model that sort of said, let's just take the results on the day and filter it down and see what are the significant factors. We knew we couldn't trust polling data, so we said, what data can we trust? We can trust data sets like the census and the labor force survey, and we can trust the actual results. So this was the results of it. And these are the sort of trees that kind of came out. So we did one for the Lib Dems just because they're an interesting group to look at what happened. But the most interesting, obviously, was the national level. So on the day of the election, everyone's freaking out. The polls are wrong. What's going on with our country? Everyone's freaking out. And our team kind of finally was able to come to the forefront. We had prepared this ahead of time. The results came in within a half hour. We had this analysis ready. We were able to say the most significant factor in the country was housing. This is what changed and helped influence the election. While all the commentators were still trying to figure out what it was, a computer had actually analyzed it before a human could comprehend what was happening. And this was a huge advancement for us. So like I said, the first branch off that is the constituency in Scotland or not? So region was a big one. But that was self-explanatory. The next one down, the algorithm found that if a constituency had less than 17% on council housing, they went to the Conservatives. 263 constituencies went to the Conservatives on that basis alone. And we then go and break down unemployment and education levels after that. But this was, like I said, a huge advancement that machine learning and computing had, like I said, analyzed before our very well-known and renowned columnists are able to do so. It's not to say that their insight, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, human insight is extremely important, but we're able to kind of push the boundaries on how computing can advance in journalism. So essentially, these are kind of the examples that I have been asked to kind of speak about, the work that we're well known at the moment at the Times and Sunday Times for doing. But as I mentioned earlier, I think this is quite a wide concept in our society right now. I do a lot of work with the kind of Institute for Government, and I do a lot of work with sort of the Royal Statistical Society or people across the board, because all of us are trying to figure this out at the moment. We need to use technology and computing to advance each of our industries. This is what we're doing in journalism to push the envelope. There's a lot more work to be done. But hopefully you found it interesting, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to take some now, or like I said, when we have drinks later. But if you have any, just let me know. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Megan. Any questions? There's a lot of food for thought in there. Any hands shooting up? Colin down here. Hang on, wait for the... and name first, if you don't mind.
Colin Elwood from the Jigsaw Network. I'm impressed that you're prepared to not analyse a data set if you don't think it's good enough. What criteria do you use to make that decision?
It's a very, very good question. Obviously, every data set is different. We obviously we like to operate on the parameter of surveys. We like something at least in the 1,000 sample size arena. But in the case of the election results, as I mentioned, the sample sizes were really small when you go to start breaking down to constituency level. So we didn't have that. Some constituencies, I think, had 20 people sampled in that area. We were unwilling to use that. And when I'm talking about skewing it, when they didn't have anything at all, they were pulling across. So it was very clear in that example. The sizes were too small for certain constituencies. Margins that they were operating on were very wide. We were noticing errors in the data itself when we were looking at the polls as well. All of these were confounding indicators together for us to make that decision. So, and I wouldn't just say as a wide, we would say, I'm not using Brexit polling data for the same reason at the moment, which we can talk about later. But I think it's just different. It's different for each thing. One other example I can give you quickly, because I can tell, sorry, I'm probably very frustrating by not giving a direct answer, is the Department for Health had released a series of information on prescription data, and then they accidentally, I believe it was an accident, released they released information the size of less than 20 people, the prescriptions given like less than 20 people within AGP practice. And normally they omit that kind of data. It needs to be used at least 50, I think, for them. But it was less than 20. I want to say there was 18 people in there. And for the type of prescriptions we were looking at, they were very indicative of a certain disease that was very rare. And we knew that if we published the results of that it could obviously identify someone. So we make the decision on that kind of case as well to reject using that kind of data set. So it's like I said, every case is different. But I'm very fortunate to have my statistician, and sometimes I have multiple statisticians working with me that are very robust in that. Right. Hopefully I answered your question. Do you have anyone else have another question?
Okay. Hang on, if we do this one first and then, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Andrew Savannison. I was just wondering, do you see your team moving towards actually using big data or machine learning to actually write stories? So I know that's something that's been starting, especially in the
robot
finance.
Journalism, yeah.
Yeah, in the finance game. I don't know if that's something you see your team moving towards.
There's discussions about that at the moment, and obviously it scares a lot of reporters in the room thinking that they're going to lose their jobs. I see it on two levels. One is it will speed up the time in which for the journalism to then continue, and they can go do more kind of feature or more in-depth writing. And it is very easy to do that. For instance, business journalism, finance, it's very, very easy. Those are written. So we are looking and exploring that at the moment to help those desks do that. But also, I find actually the more useful element is using robot journalism in different ways. So I envision a world in which, before we're checking the wires, we're checking a bot that we wrote overnight to monitor different government sites we want to keep an eye on. Or you're checking a script over, like I said, a press release that's coming through. I see sort of bots in that, using bots and using scripts and using scrapers as a means to kind of monitor areas that you want to investigate, and that's the kind of thing where I see robot journalism being much more influential. But we are experimenting at the moment with using that kind of script writing for the kind of basic stories, and then adding a human touch at the end of it. It hasn't been implemented yet. Definitely thoughts, though.
Hi. So obviously there's
So
far
could
more...
you just introduce yourself and then...
Kate Brand, Home Office. Obviously there is far more things that you know out there than you could ever do. So I'm just interested, I guess, in how you decide what to do. Is it very much bottom up, or is there still a lot of top down in terms of what you have to do?
That's a good question. That is the trick at the moment, is when you realize there's so much information out there, how do you even begin? It still is very top down in that sense. So because my team is quite small, I've specifically focused it on investigations. I mean, there's only 4 of us and we work for 2 newspapers. As you can imagine, every desk is interested in us helping with something. So we tend to be more investigative just because the bigger the story, the more impact we have as a team to continue the work that we do, improving ourselves. So it tends to be something like that, like a leak, something exclusive that we have that nobody else has. That's why a lot of the stories that I've shown you are of that. But the kind of GP's interesting was just someone coming to us. So it's either very pressing news relevant things that the editor or a journalist is interested in, or a leak that's come to us that we tend to focus on. But then we have, of course, a backlog of things that'd be really interesting to investigate. Great data sets coming out of the Home Office, for instance. I have a bot that notifies me every time you drop a new data set, but I don't do very much about it most times because we have so many things in the works. So we're hoping to kind of push that a bit more by a lot of the public data sets. But at the moment, because we're so small, we focus a lot more on the exclusive investigative work.
Thank you. We have one more question. Go on, at the back.
Here?
Go on. And then any other questions we can
You
pose
can
to
grab me
Megan
after as well.
outside, so.
Bart McCarthy, University of Nottingham. Thank you for being so open, actually intriguing hearing this presentation. A bit of a cheeky question related to the robot journalism question. Do you get a byline for all of this work?
I've actually taken this stance personally for our team. We have a team byline. So we are the Times data team or the Sunday Times data team when we work on a collaborative effort. I think it shows that first of all, it proves to the reader that the paper is investing in one. And it gives our team, like I said, when we often collaborate, that it kind of shows that rigor. At the end, our names are listed, the people who work on the team. But when any of my data journalists work individually, they get their own bylines as well. It's been a long time, 3 years, and we're finally integrating in the newsroom, but initially it wasn't. Initially, they did find it very difficult to kind of allow these sort of nerds to kind of walk into this old school newsroom and say, we're going to tell you how we're going to do things different. And it did take a long time, but we've, I think, proven that we can get them stories that they've never done, and they realize we've got our own ideas and our own methods of doing it too. So we really now are given bylines as equally as journalists. But I've actually taken the position as our team to do a joint byline, mainly to give it, I think a bit more strength, because not every newspaper does invest in one that we have. So at the moment, we do have a team byline.
Thank you. Can we all thank Megan so much for this?
Of course.
Thank you.